Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back to listen to more stories. This is part two of Each Other's Business. It wasn't a perfect apartment, but Terry could afford it, and she liked the woman who owned the house. Mitzi was divorced herself and had the basement of her home converted to help pay the mortgage. This Saturday, with Jason and Annie at their father's, Terry and Mitzi were spending the day sitting in the backyard drinking mimosas. Terry felt her body go slack after the third or fourth, and even the noisy neighbor kids jumping in and out of the pool didn't bother her. Nothing could touch her at all. She'd found that elusive balance between sober and drunk that felt like floating. It wouldn't last long, 15, 20 minutes tops, and another drink wouldn't extend the feeling, only push it beyond the feeling into another feeling, and the second feeling was always depressing, and led to crying in the bedroom with her face in a pillow. Today, she wasn't in the mood to cry. Mitzi was always up for something she'd learned, and out of the blue, Terry asked her friend and landlord if she wanted to drive down to Yato Sky for a little adventure. She said she'd never been to a casino before, and Mitzi said, "What about Gary?" And Terry said, "Gary doesn't own me." And Mitzi said, "Well, what are you sitting there for?" And then both of them were up and pulling shirts on over their bathing suit tops and tossing a few essentials into their bags and climbing into Mitzi's Toyota and driving down the highway listening to an old cassette of Steve Miller's greatest hits, singing loudly to "Take the Money and Run." And even though it felt a bit forced, Terry gave in to the rush and sort of forgot she even had kids, at least for a few minutes at a time. And when those little worries about Jason being bullied into tattling, or Annie being left alone in the back bedroom that used to be storage and wasn't much bigger than a closet, the bed just crammed in there where she wasn't even allowed to have stuffed animals because they were like false idols, like some sort of witchery, and oh, her poor blonde baby. When those thoughts started, she turned up the Steve Miller and belted out, "Jungle Love, you're driving me mad, you're making me crazy," until all she could think about was spending her money. Part of her wanted Mitzi to turn back, part of her wanted to jump from the car as it passed over a bridge, and part of her wanted, just a little, to call Derek and tell him to keep the kids, that he was right, that she was a loose woman of low character, and a part of her wanted to simply prove him right, to make a big scene, wind up in the news, fuck a lot of strangers, and flip over some blackjack tables. She knew she could do none of those things. Mitzi was all energy. Her skirt was hiked up and tucked between her thighs, and her shirt was unbuttoned, and whenever a car full of boys honked at her, she grabbed a boob and licked her lips. Terry laughed each time, and Mitzi said, "There's nothing funny about it. I need to get laid." And when Terry laughed again, Mitzi said, "I'm serious. I'm only 36, and I've had sex twice in the last 2 years, and once was with Pete, her ex, which was an epic mistake I won't repeat again. And I'm a sexual being." She shouted the last part, "sexual being," and it echoed in the Toyota, filling up all the spaces that might otherwise have been packed with worry. Just as Mitzi's declaration began to fade, Steve Miller started to sing "Fly Like an Eagle," and for a few miles, Terry thought about the time she'd actually seen an eagle, or what looked to her like an eagle, as she drove across the country with her parents. When no one else was looking, she'd spotted it circling high over the trees, a flash of white across its head and tips of its feathers, and then her father was talking about that son of a bitch Nixon, that lying, betraying son of a bitch, and she almost stopped him from talking. But the bird was so solitary, and so quickly a mere dot behind them, that she didn't dare disrupt his rant to point out something that was no longer there. By the time they reached the casino, both of them were wore out. The sun beat down on the car in the parking lot, and they were uncomfortable and sweaty and not looking forward to gambling at all, but they'd driven this far and wanted so badly to have some fun that they pretended to want to be standing in the entranceway, to want to be sizing up the men, most of whom were woefully unattractive, overweight, plagued with obvious anxiety and gastrointestinal distress, or were too slick, too obviously oiled and dangerous for their own good, flashing their whitened teeth and crispy tanning booth skin. They both wanted to pass through the archway onto the casino floor, past the ringing and clattering slot machines, where legions of old women perched with cups of coins and Diet Coke and rum, asses too big for the stool cushions, greedy eyes locked onto the spinning displays. The room wasn't bright, but it wasn't dark either. It was somewhere in between, or it was totally bright over there, but once Terry looked over there, it was dark, and the brightness had moved. No matter where she looked, what drew her eye was somewhere else. There were no windows, but the ceiling was painted and lit like a night sky, like the real thing, stars twinkling over a vast curvature of plaster, deep blues and purples pulsing, an acre of nocturnal paints. Wasn't it just daylight? Mitzi said. It is daylight, Terry said. It's only 1 o'clock. I don't see a single guy here I'd want to fuck, Mitzi said. And as she said it, 2 boys. Terry assumed they were barely out of college, tried their luck. One, the blonde one, said, "Hey, ladies, what brings you in from the cold?" Mitzi snorted. "Christ," she said, "seriously? What brought us in from the cold?" She couldn't think of anything else to say, so she simply stood there with her hands on her hips until the boys walked away. "You know," Mitzi said, "I don't really have a lot of money to be toying around with." "Oh, thank God," Terry said. "Those mimosas were talking to us, weren't they?" "This is too depressing," Mitzi said. "These people need to get outside and go to the beach," Terry said. She thought back fondly on the feeling of freedom she'd felt not 2 hours ago after her 3rd drink, and how she didn't want to ruin the feeling, or transform the feeling by taking another drink. But now that she was here, the idea of drinking herself past freedom and into morbid reflection and a lost day of self-pity seemed rather a more prudent option. On the way home, Steve Miller's jolly and rollicking good times were replaced by a somber, investigative piece from NPR concerning the very real human tragedy of Darfur. For many miles, Terry suppressed the urge to vomit from Mitzi's window.